we have been very fortunate in raising a series of endowed chairs over the last 4 or 5 years, in which Barry MacLean and Dean Madara and others have been major helpers. But we've never had an inaugural lecture. The inaugural lecture for an endowed chair is a tradition actually at many universities, including the University of Chicago, but not so much a tradition at the medical school. And so today's inaugural lecture is the first for us, and I'm delighted that the person who will be speaking is the holder of the new chair called the Kilbride-Clinton Chair in Medicine and Ethics. Dan Sulmasy is an internist, medical practitioner who reflects all the values that the MacLean Center holds in the sense of people who write about ethics, also doing ethics in their everyday practice. He's a teacher, trained at Cornell and later at Johns Hopkins on the Osler service, where he won the award for clinical excellence. He's a scholar of medicine and religion and spirituality, the author of 5 or 6 books and many articles on end-of-life care, on double effect, on religion and spirituality in medicine. We're so delighted that he has accepted our offer to come to Chicago for the first time in the 100-year history of the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. Dan, for the first time, holds a joint appointment between the medical school and the Divinity School. This has never happened before. The Kilbride-Clinton Chair is in honor of Dr. Kilbride, who was a turn-of-the-century, 1890s, 1900, rural general practitioner in the state of Minnesota, Canby, Minnesota. It was a name of a little town, southwestern Minnesota, and Mr. Clinton's mother remembers her father going out on snowy nights in the sled to deliver babies or to see patients. And Dan has never experienced a Chicago winter, so we'll buy him a sled. Dan Sulmasy is going to speak to us in the inaugural lecture of the Kilbride-Clinton Chair on the value of life. Please help me join him. Please join me.
Thanks, Mark, for that very gracious introduction. Thanks to the MacLeans, certainly for their unflagging support for this program. To the Clintons for their vision and generosity in endowing this chair, and especially to Mark for his extraordinary leadership. You see the results of that will be in the photo when you get the print of all those faculty and fellows joined together. I said the other night that a chair is not just a prize, but I think it's an opportunity. It's an honor, certainly, but it's really, in my view, an incentive for new and hopefully better work, better scholarship, better teaching, better patient care, and I hope that I'm going to be worthy of the trust that the university has placed in me in granting me this chair. And in keeping with the theme of this morning, I'm going to talk about this issue of the value of life. The title was The Value of Life, but I'm actually going to be talking more about talking about the value of life. The notion of the value of life is often invoked in our discussions regarding medical care for the sick and the dying. And I want to argue that many of the commonly used phrases in those sorts of debates, such as the sanctity of life, the infinite value of life, the value of life itself, the quality of life, states worse than death, we heard a little bit about that, biographical life versus biological life, the difference between being alive and having a life. I think a lot of these phrases are unclear at best or misguided at worst. Now, I fully realize that in rejecting the language used by almost everybody on all sides of a debate is no way to make friends. The aim of this talk, however, is greater conceptual clarity, and I hope that I have friends here who will join me in that endeavor. The fundamental question underlying all these arguments in which these phrases are used concerns what we mean by the value of life. For the purposes of this talk, I don't intend to try to prove that a particular view of the value of life is correct. I only want to advance a more modest claim that it's at least reasonable to hold the view that I do, that life has intrinsic value, that this view is reasonable at least compared to some competitive views. And I then want to go on to discuss certain important and useful distinctions in language and metaphysics before moving on to make more substantive philosophical claims about what's entailed and not entailed by the view that life has intrinsic value when we bring that idea to the bedside. Now, one alternative to the view that life has intrinsic value is that's offered by utilitarians. But the problem that I have is that for utilitarians, life can only have instrumental value. Formally, utilitarian value always depends upon some future state. Nothing for a utilitarian that exists now, not even life, has any value in itself. It's always about what good it will produce in the future. What counts as valuable about a life, then, is the net outcome of that life, measured by whatever each specific brand of utilitarianism considers the good that must be maximized over the social unit in question, whether that's pleasure or social contribution or net satisfaction of individual preferences. Obviously, we can say a huge amount more about this. I only want to argue here that at least one important reason why I reject utilitarianism as a theory of ethics is that it seems to give so meager an account of the value of life. Surely the value of our lives is already a given in the present and not exhausted by our considerations about a possible yet to be realized future. There are many other reasons why I'm not a utilitarian, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to say any more at this point. Another alternative are the liberal accounts. And as would be expected, they emphasize individual preferences, interests, and life plans. These liberal answers tend to give important emphasis to the value of an individual human life, and in that sense, I think, are preferable to utilitarianism. However, in solving this one problem, my view, they create perhaps an even larger philosophical problem, and that's dualism. Broadly speaking, these liberal accounts, the value of life is something that each individual assigns to his or her own life. An arresting phrase that you've heard, they even make plays about this, whose life is it anyway, imparts rhetorical power to that notion. But such a phrase, to me, doesn't actually make a lot of sense as a philosophical account of the value of life. Liberal accounts of the value of life only make sense if there is some I that is independent of my life and able to assign value to it. But to whom or what is one referring with such linguistic constructions? Where is this I that is independent of my life and assigns value to it? Maybe it's in Descartes' pineal gland? I'm not sure. I think that I am neither identical with my preferences nor independent of my life. There is no locus independent of me as a living embodied organism from which my plans and preferences arise. I have a life, I live it, but the I that evaluates the life that I have led is not something independent of the narrative trajectory that I have traversed through space and time as this single embodied being who has lived that life. I'm not a dualist, and I'm not a materialist reductionist. I subscribe to what's called a hylomorphic account of substance. And on this account, we may distinguish legitimately between persons and lives, mind and body, bearing in mind we can only do so conceptually. It's not a real distinction. In reality, in my view, there just are no disembodied persons who assign value to their bodily lives. Now, lots more could be said about that. My only purpose has been to describe these utilitarian and liberal views briefly in order to move on, having explained why, at least if one assumes that both life has intrinsic value and that person and mind are really inseparable from life and body, then neither the utilitarian nor the liberal view of the value of life is tenable. Now, before I go on to the next part of the talk, there are going to be a few more little philosophical preparations here, so please, I know it's late in the morning, bear with me. I hope it'll pay off in the end. The first is to talk about some various meanings of the word is. The second will be to distinguish between the transcendental and the transcendent, and then between the transcendental and the empirical. Now, the first concerns the various meanings of the word is. So bear with me a second. I'm sure a lot of you have heard this, but anyway, we can start with some simple parts about it. Bill Clinton obviously gave a bad reputation to the idea that is has a variety of meanings. But whatever one thinks about the morality of his behavior in the Oval Office one infamous snowy night in Washington, D.C., or his attempts to employ careful linguistic analysis in his legal defense, from a philosophical point of view, Clinton had every right to ask, what do you mean by the word is? Philosophers distinguish various uses of the word is. One of these is called the is of identity. Is may be used to convey the proposition that two things are identical. For example, one uses the word this way if one says, the morning star is the evening star. A second use of the word is the is of existence. Is may be used to mean that something either exists or does not exist. For example, we use the word this way if we say there is such a thing as a unicorn, the is of existence. Another use of the word is conveys what's called predication. Is may be used to predicate or describe properties of something. For example, we use the word is that way when we say that automobile is green. Now, in English, we use the same two letters to convey these several different meanings. Keeping track of these differences can be rather tricky, and they get rarely made in ordinary discourse. You only resort to careful use of these words when you're doing something really important, like trying not to get impeached, or pointing out errors in philosophical arguments. Now, I want to return to these in a few minutes because I think that deep confusion about the various meanings of the word is have infected a lot of our bioethical discussions about the value of life, particularly in end-of-life care. Now, the second philosophical theme is a distinction between the words transcendent and transcendental. Again, these are often sort of treated as synonymous, but they're really distinct, and it's important to keep these in mind. Transcendent means beyond space and time, beyond the finite. Generally, it refers to some spiritual dimension of existence, eternity, for instance, as opposed to time, heaven, as opposed to outer space. The transcendent relates to what is beyond the human, what's divine, angelic, holy, supernatural, or sacred. The word transcendent is often used as a synonym, but that's a serious mistake. Iris Murdoch pithily puts it this way: what is transcendent is beyond human experience. What is transcendental is not derived from human experience, but is a condition of it. Now again, I mark this distinction because I think something very much like a conflation between transcendent and transcendental is going on in much of our speech about the sanctity of life and our moral arguments about care for the sick and the dying. Now the last, the transcendental is not only to be distinguished from the transcendent, we also have to distinguish it from the empirical. The transcendental relates to, for instance, the epistemological preconditions for the possibility of experience, the a priori conditions for the possibility of knowledge. Think of Kant's transcendental deduction this way. One need not accept all of Kantian metaphysics to appreciate that there are some things, such as, for instance, being a perceiving and knowing subject, that are preconditions for the possibility of experience. By contrast, the empirical encompasses all that we perceive and can know by experience. The empirical is a posteriori. It follows upon this ontological priority of the a priori transcendental. Okay, so if you're with me, I hope, take a deep breath. I'm going to try to make some use of this now in our to look at some of our discourse about value in end-of-life care decision-making. I want to consider what's wrong with many of the ways in which the notion of the value of life figures in arguments about ethics of care at the end of life, especially when we consider it from the point of view that I hold, that life has intrinsic value. I'll make a number of points about clinical language then and ethics at the end of life. The first, and I'm going to give you some real quotes so you know these things are used, but I'm sure they resonate with your experience. A famous rabbi was recently quoted by a Catholic physician approvingly saying this: "Human life has infinite value. Any fraction of human life has infinite value, since any part of infinity is still infinite." But the value of life cannot be considered infinite. Life is finite. This is philosophy 101, right? All people are mortal. If life were of infinite value, then it would trump every other conceivable human value. To what would the disvalue of excruciating pain amount compared with the infinite value of even a few nanoseconds of life? How could we raise the speed limit from 55 to 65 miles an hour, knowing that there will be some persons who die, if life has infinite value? I don't think any of us really believe, nor is it philosophically tenable to suggest that life has truly infinite value. Second, for a biological creature, life and existence are the same. Being and living are the same. Here I'm using the is of identity. Death, biologically and philosophically speaking, is non-existence. Life is existence. Now, while the value of life is not infinite, the value of life can coherently, I think, and properly be said to be priceless. Now, I don't know if any of the economists are still here in the room, but they'll probably be having seizures right now. But not every finite value can be cashed out in figures of dollars and cents, except by the crassest of utilitarians, who, as Bernard Williams once observed, could only be said to subscribe to the old adage that every man has his price. That's not ethics for me. Kant wrote that there is a value that is priceless. He wrote that the value that has no price is our humanity. The value of our humanity is not infinite, but it is a value unlike other values that can be assigned a price. It is of a different order. Treatments have prices. Patients do not. Turning people into commodities and assigning them prices is a practice I hope we abandoned with the abolition of slavery. Fourth, in actually a recent survey of European neonatologists, somewhere between 24 and 33% agreed with this statement. Because human life is sacred, everything possible should be done to ensure a neonate's survival, however severe the prognosis. Can any real sense be made of the contention that life is sacred? On the basis of what I argued at the beginning, this phrase can't mean that life itself has transcendent value. One might suggest that the phrase means that human beings are windows to the sacred, or that there are interpersonal experiences that can lead human beings to the sacred, but it cannot mean that we of ourselves as human beings have transcendent value. What the phrases human beings have a value that is beyond price or human life is sacred, I think, can mean rationally and coherently is that life has a transcendental value, not a transcendent value. Life is the precondition for the possibility of burdens and benefits, the condition for the possibility of love, freedom, joy, prayer, pleasure, happiness, also the precondition for the possibility of hatred, servitude, blasphemy, pain, and unhappiness. As such, life itself is not of an order that permits pricing. Life is the condition for the possibility of pricing. In this sense, it is beyond price. It has this transcendental value. Sixth, life is always a given. Not one of us has ever chosen to come into existence. No matter how good genetic engineering becomes, you will never be able to choose your own biological parents, right? We are not the causes of our own coming into existence. And this is a metaphysical truth, not merely a biological one. In this sense, the value of life itself is not created by the people who live those lives, nor even experienced by such persons, but simply lived by us. Seventh, the benefits and the burdens associated with life-sustaining treatment are qualities of our existence, qualities of our lives. Logically speaking, these are predicates. This is the is of predication. When one says that the patient is in pain, for instance, one is using the is of predication. Life itself is neither a benefit nor a burden. Life's value is transcendental. Now, in discussing the withholding and withdrawing of life-sustaining treatments, there's one ethicist who's written this: we must never make judgments about the quality of a patient's life. And you may have heard very similar statements. I would suggest that in making the decision to forego life-sustaining treatments, one is always making judgments about the quality of life. If one thinks that one is ever justified in stopping a life-sustaining treatment, one is committed to the proposition that decisions about the quality of life are morally permissible. It's contradictory to hold that it is ever justifiable to forego any form of life-sustaining treatment, but also hold that you're prohibited from making any quality of life judgments. The burdens and the benefits of treatment are predicates of the patient, always. They're not predicates of the machine. A judgment about the net sum of the burdens and the benefits of continuing a treatment for Mrs. Jones or whoever it is a judgment about the quality of her life given that treatment and given the rest of her condition. This is not to say that a weighing of burdens and benefits is total judgment about the value of Mrs. Jones, because the fundamental value of Mrs. Jones is transcendental. But it is a judgment about the quality of her existence, about the predicates associated with the treatment. Now, I want to make sure you're not thinking that there's any dualism here involved in making judgments, because an integrated person, a living human being, can make judgments about the predicates associated with his or her state of existence, treatment or lack of treatment. I can judge the qualities of my life as an individual, and you can make judgments about the qualities of my life as well. But not everybody agrees. A web-based guide for helping patients to make decisions about care at the end of life states, and I just got this recently, life itself is always a good and is a quality that can never be lost. Again, to speak of life itself as a quality is to make this mistake of conflating the is of existence with the is of predication. Life itself is not a quality of life. It's not a predicate, and can't be judged a burden or a benefit. Those who say that life itself is always a benefit of life-sustaining treatment are making a metaphysical mistake in their ethical reasoning, conflating the is of existence and the is of predication. And this error in reasoning sometimes leads people to a mistaken judgment that they prohibit the foregoing of life-sustaining treatments when such a decision might be rational and perfectly consistent with respect for the transcendental value of human life. And they're making that mistake simply because they're confused by their own rhetoric. The intrinsic value of life, this transcendental value, commands, I think, respect, both on the part of the person whose life it is and on the part of others who recognize this value in other human beings. It is in such a vein that the philosopher David Velleman has argued that there must be a value to human beings that is prior to their interests and their rights. He's called this an interest-independent value, saying that in order to respect someone's interests, we must first respect the one whose interests they are. Such a value is transcendental, the condition for the possibility of interests or rights. And I would suggest then that it is reasonable to make a priori moral determinations about the value of life, while acknowledging that one would not or could not make an a priori determination about the quality of life. The value of life and the quality of life are actually incommensurable. They're different orders of value. The quality of life is a posteriori. The value of life is transcendental and a priori. A priori, I want to bear in mind, means prior to experience. It doesn't mean infinite. Now, this distinction between a priori and a posteriori value provides a moral explanation for the fairly traditional distinction between killing and allowing to die. Not killing is a way of respecting the a priori value of life itself. Intentions are a priori, and one's intentional stance before the a priori value of life, in my view, matters morally and matters deeply. Burdens and benefits, however, are a posteriori. They concern our empirical experience of illness, of injury, and of treatment. Provided we do not intentionally kill, the finitude of life, which is manifested starkly by our empirical experience, permits us to desist in our efforts to stay alive or to keep others alive. But some might object, hopefully no one in this room, but others certainly have. Regarding the use of feeding tubes, for instance, in advanced dementia, there's a clinician who wrote, "Life itself is a benefit, no matter how disabled the person might be." But it should now be clear why this is a serious mistake. Life itself is not a benefit of treatment. Life itself is not a predicate or a quality, but the condition for the possibility of there being any quality, any burden, or any benefit. Traditionally speaking, we ought to, I think, argue in two steps. First, given its transcendental value, we do not, as physicians, kill our patients. However, second, given the fact that the value of life is transcendental, but not transcendent, we can ask what are the a priori conditions that temper our prima facie obligation to persist as finite creatures in a finite world. We are finite. Our treatments are often burdensome and of little or no benefit. So the questions we ask are, what are we obliged to do to preserve ourselves or to preserve others in life? This is the calculus of burdens and benefits of treatment. Life itself, again, is not a benefit of treatment, but a condition for the possibility that there would be burden or benefit. The value of life itself is a given. It's not a consequence of treatment. Now, it might be objected that any treatment that's not physiologically futile can extend life, and so life is properly considered a benefit of treatment. We have to be careful, however, to distinguish between the value of life itself, which is a priori, transcendental, and commanding our deontological respect, and the value of life extension. Life extension refers to temporal duration. Duration is a predicate. Existence is not a predicate. The transcendental primacy of the value of life itself ought not to be reduced trivially to something that can be measured by clocks or calendars. The value of human life itself, in my view, does not admit of degrees and is radically equal among all of us. Someone who lives 1 minute or someone who lives to be 100 years old both have radically equal intrinsic value as human beings. We can consider the possibility of prolonging life as a benefit of treatment, but only as one among other possible burdens and benefits of treatment, not as some special predicate that has automatic primacy over other predicates associated with the life of the individual. The length of life is not the value of life. Now, the last set of words I'll take on is this one. There are a number of investigators, and we heard a little bit about it this morning, who have undertaken to measure states worse than death, and, quote, full of the conviction that it is clear that such states exist. Perhaps I'm going to try to give you some explanation of why Peter's Ubel's patients were confused, because I certainly am by the concept. Talk of states worse than death, I think, is conceptually confused. It has strong rhetorical attraction, but I don't think it can literally be true. Patients can certainly be asked to compare the qualities associated with life and the qualities associated with death to produce some kind of utility ratio, and there are plenty of studies now that have people doing this. This doesn't imply, however, that the construct is meaningful. The mere fact that you can assign a number to a construct does not assure us that there's a reality to which those numbers point. Recall that the proponents of the Ptolemaic universe were able to defend their system with grand mathematics and invented the theory of epicycles to do this. They could back up their theory with numbers, but they were simply wrong about the nature of the universe. Likewise, the ability to assign a utility value to death doesn't mean that non-existence has a utility for a person who no longer exists. How might a phrase like a state worse than death be understood? Well, one way might be as a quality or predicate of the individual, right? However, that can't be correct. I can't have the property of not existing, right? Just as existence is not a predicate, so non-existence is not a predicate. So perhaps we might take this as referring to the quality or state of the individual and the supposition that he or she is already dead. But this formulation also makes no sense. Nothing can be predicated of a non-existent, not even hypothetically. As I've argued, for a biological entity, being alive and existing are equivalent. If I do not exist, I cannot have any properties. There is no quality to my non-existence. It makes no sense to say, for instance, I would be better off without me. So perhaps one ought to think about this phrase as an expression of a present preference for some future state of affairs in which you don't exist. But if you do this, the theorists would say you can either do it by an individual utility analysis or a social utility analysis. And problems arise on both of those presuppositions as well. If you adopt the individual perspective, what the patient is doing is making a judgment about the world in which he or she does not exist. Remember, you can't, and he or she would only be commenting on some possible future world. In effect, the patient would be saying then, the world would be better off without me. This is what suicidally depressed people do and would be a prima facie reason, I think, for questioning the patient's decision-making capacity. And further, such a state couldn't even be conceptually an empirically falsifiable state, because how could I or any patient judge the quality of a world in which I or the patient does not exist? So we might say, well, we should adopt the social perspective in our utility analysis, but that raises an even more troubling interpretation of the claim that there are states worse than death, because then we'd be saying that the world is making the claim that the world would be better off without the patient. That doesn't seem to be what patients are saying when they use that phrase. So accordingly, I can only conclude that it's metaphorical. That there are states worse than death can mean, for instance, I'm suffering terribly, or I don't want to go on with this much longer. But the phrase can't literally be true and ought not be studied empirically as if it were describing something that were actually a true existent. So, to conclude, and thanks for bearing with me here, I haven't attempted to prove that life has intrinsic value, but I think I've tried to at least suggest some good reasons one might hold for thinking so, by showing that the alternatives have some serious problems. The instrumentalism involved in the utilitarian concept of the value of life, or the dualism that's involved in some liberal theories of the value of life. I've also suggested that the value of life itself, if it is intrinsic, is transcendental and not transcendent. That means that we can say that it is priceless, but it is not infinite, not infinite. I've also suggested that withholding and withdrawing decisions that we make always involve judgments about the quality of a person's life. I've tried to suggest that in killing, that there's a direct attack on the a priori transcendental value of the person, the value of life itself, and that allowing to die is permissible if death is not intended and the judgment is only based upon the a posteriori values, the qualities of that person's existence. Life itself, we better be careful about this, is not a benefit of treatment nor part of the benefit-burden calculus, and that talk of states worse than death is only figurative. What's the upshot of all of this? Well, first, I hope I have not alienated everybody in the room by taking away your pet phrase. And I hope you've been able to see there's some sense to thinking more clearly about this. If you remain a committed utilitarian or liberal, at least I hope you can understand some more about the reasonability of an alternative view, and perhaps have benefited from a clearer understanding of your own language and conceptualizations. And if you agree with me that life has intrinsic value, then I hope your thinking and your language have been sharpened substantially, because, in fact, most of this abusive language has come from people who think that life has intrinsic value. My great hope is that clearer language and clearer thinking will lead us to morally better decisions at the bedside, which, as Mark suggested, is where it all comes down in the end. Because our concepts and the words we use to convey them have real consequences, very serious consequences, regarding how we treat patients at the end of life. So, thank you very much. Thank you.
Dan has kindly agreed to take a number of questions. I neglected to say in my introduction, although his talk brings the point out forcefully, that in addition to his other training, Dan is trained as a PhD in philosophy by actually Dr. Edmund Pellegrino, who's with us today as Dan's mentor. I did want to recognize Ed. Thank you. So I'm going to turn the podium back to Dan.
Far, yes.
You mentioned that the distinction between killing and letting die makes sense if one understands the transcendental value, or the transcendental value of life. And then I was thinking about, as we were thinking about veterinary science versus medicine, the life of animals is also transcendental in the sense that it's a priori to the experience, etc. And yet we know that we can, well, our intuition is we can kill animals and not humans. So is there something else that has to be added to that transcendental characteristic?
Sure. No, it's a great question, and in the interest of time, and because it would take a few more complicated steps to get to the link between the transcendental value of the human and the concept of dignity, that I didn't fill that part out. But that would probably be another important part of that argument, so that the transcendental value of the human is special in that way, and not simply a priori. No, that's a terrific question for people who didn't hear it because the microphones aren't always good, is what about killing in self-defense or other kinds of casuistic exceptions? Again, in the longer paper, I've got something to say about those casuistic exceptions. It has to be carefully nuanced. What I think is going on in those kinds of cases is that when you're in a forced choice situation where either one person dies or the other, then in fact in either of those cases, whatever choice you make, the same value is going to be lost, and so you're allowed under those casuistic circumstances to make either kind of choice. That, coupled with the kind of stuff that Farr was suggesting about the link to dignity. But again, that's a much longer kind of argument. You may want to turn off your microphones for the feedback there. Thanks. Good. As having been a moderator up here, I know about that. Yes, Vaughn.
Dan. I can understand your difficulty with the utilitarian or the liberal perspective, but I'd like to hear more of a sort of justification for the hylomorphic without a teleology. If you're going to base that either in a neo-Aristotelian perspective or not, you're going to have to postulate some sense of eudaimonia or some sense of ultimate causal dimension. I'm particularly thinking what you would say to people studying genocide in that context, where the modal elements of life and value are in constant flux without that actual postulated, more Aristotelian Greek sense of teleology, which is either fictitious or not.
Sure. No, again, this is only trying to get one slice of the pie, and obviously, yes, I am something of a neo-Aristotelian, and I would suggest that, for instance, following somebody like Philip Foote, my conception of the good is that it means for the thing to flourish as the kind of thing that it is, which would be a kind of congenially Aristotelian sense of eudaimonia or happiness. And so, yes, I think that has to be part built into the full argument. Right here, I'm trying to just take a slice of it, try to talk about some of the language, but without doing the whole argument.
The previous question already made a point that I would make, that, of course, you know that you could connect this Kantian transcendental approach to a more basically Aristotelian hylomorphic approach, which has really developed even further. It's wonderful to have my Dominican colleague, Father O'Rourke, sitting right here in that thought of Thomas Aquinas, where the existence part is clearly built into that. And also, it's a wonderful tribute to Ed Pellegrino, to whom we are all greatly indebted, who has been the great apostle of Aristotle through all these years. There's a final thing I'd just like to contribute about your use of language. Often I find doctors, when they are faced with agonizing end-of-life choices and versus the same thing, they'll use a phrase like, oh, the patient's life is in my hands. And that makes them very afraid then to do various kinds of palliative or all kinds of other quality of life things. I think you pointed out quite clearly that that phrase is misleading in itself. The patient's health and well-being, the a posteriori values, are all in your hands, but not the intrinsic patient's life is not. That's a very, very helpful thing.
Absolutely, thank you. I agree.
I want to thank you so much for inaugurating our new system of doing the lecture on the acceptance of the chair, and all of us congratulate you on becoming the Kilbride Clinton Professor.